McGraw-Hill Audio presents The Marine Corps Way, using maneuver warfare to lead a winning organization. Written by Jason A. Santamaria, Vincent Martino, and Eric K. Clemons, Ph.D. Read by Michael Prichard. Chapter 1. Maneuver Warfare. Reality is chaotic. Events in business never proceed exactly as planned. Environmental factors, such as unforeseeable contingencies, fleeting opportunities, rapid and disruptive change, and market-altering technological innovations, all contribute to a natural tendency toward disorder that frustrates business leaders and military leaders alike. Opponents' actions, designed to alter or even destroy order, limit the successful implementation of well-laid plans. A heightened threat of global terrorism and the recent slew of corporate scandals have only aggravated this tendency toward disorder. The events of September 11, 2001, have altered our personal and professional sense of safety, security, and certainty, perhaps for many years to come. And the blatant lapses in integrity by executives at companies such as Enron, Health South, Tyco, and WorldCom have eroded investors' faith in corporate America and underscored the need for trust and integrity in the character of our business leaders. Business leaders thus need a novel approach that takes these realities into account and even enables organizations to thrive in their midst. Such an approach exists, but outside the business world, on the battlefield. Maneuver warfare aims to outflank the enemy through a sequence of rapid, focused, and unpredictable moves that target his weaknesses and render him unable to analyze or respond effectively. Equally compelling should be the emphasis that maneuver warfare places on trust, integrity, initiative, and unselfishness, four intangibles that we could use a little more of in today's business environment. Finally, the approach that we are advocating is a prescription that recognizes the ethical implications of actions taken. In business, as in war, the line between fighting smart and fighting dirty should never be crossed. Maneuver warfare defined. Maneuver warfare represents, in the words of war fighting, a state of mind bent on shattering the enemy morally and physically by paralyzing and confounding him, by avoiding his strength, by quickly and aggressively exploiting his vulnerabilities, and by striking him in a way that will hurt him most. Its ultimate objective is not to destroy the adversary's forces, but simply to render them unable to fight as an effective, coordinated whole. For example, instead of attacking well-established enemy defensive positions, maneuver warfare prescribes bypassing those positions, capturing the enemy's command and control center in the rear, and cutting off supply lines. Moreover, it embraces the uncontrollable factors that inevitably shape competitive encounters as keys to vanquishing the foe. This approach stands in stark contrast to more simplistic and brutish forms of combat, so-called wars of attrition, where combatants lined up in fixed positions and endeavored to overwhelm one another with superior firepower, as wars were generally fought through the First World War. The nature of warfare. To understand maneuver warfare, you must first understand warfare, the larger context into which maneuver fits. A resource-based conflict mediated by human and environmental factors, warfare is a continuous process of move and countermove where opposing forces are constantly trying to impose their respective wills on one another. This ultimate test of will takes place on multiple levels. On the physical level, it is a test of firepower, weapons technology, troop strength, and logistics. At the psychological level, it involves intangibles such as morale, leadership, and courage. At the analytical level, it challenges the ability of commanders to assess complex battlefield situations, make effective decisions, communicate their decisions through highly distributed information systems to widely dispersed forces, and formulate tactically superior plans to implement those decisions. If these dimensions seem familiar to most business leaders, so will the four human and environmental factors that, according to war fighting, shape military conflict: friction, uncertainty, fluidity, and disorder. 1. Friction is the phenomenon that makes the simple difficult and the difficult seemingly impossible. The most obvious source of friction is the enemy, but it can also result from natural forces such as terrain or weather, internal forces such as a lack of planning or coordination, the independent nature of human will, or even mere chance. 2. Uncertainty is the atmosphere in which all actions in war take place, the so-called fog of war. Uncertainty about the opponent's intentions and capabilities, and about environmental factors, cloud decision-makers' judgment and prohibit the optimal deployment of resources. 3. Fluidity describes the battlefield situation in which each event merges with those that precede and follow it, shaped by the former and shaping the conditions of the latter, creating a continuous, fluctuating flow of activity replete with fleeting opportunities and unforeseen events. Combatants must constantly adapt to these changing conditions and actively seek to shape emerging events. 4. Combined, these three factors constitute the final key attribute of military conflict, the state toward which warfare naturally gravitates: disorder. In an environment of friction, uncertainty, and fluidity, according to the Marines' manual, plans will go awry, instructions and information will be unclear and misinterpreted, communications will fail, and mistakes and unforeseen events will be commonplace. Quite simply, disorder implies a competitive situation that deteriorates as time progresses. Functioning, or even surviving, in a disordered environment is a major challenge. But the military commander, as well as the business leader, must be sure that his troops do more than survive. They must prevail. Because the four human and environmental factors that shape competitive encounters can rarely be controlled, the successful commander will opt for the only viable alternative, using them to his advantage. This notion serves as the core of maneuver warfare. Instead of succumbing to disorder, the military commander turns friction, uncertainty, and fluidity against the enemy to generate disorder in his ranks, ideally creating a situation in which the opposition simply cannot cope. The evolution of maneuver warfare. With a better understanding of the larger context into which maneuver warfare fits, we now turn to history. You will no doubt recognize many of the names that follow. What may be less readily apparent is why they have stood the test of time. But understanding why and seeing how maneuver warfare has evolved over time are, in our estimation, crucial to the process of distilling it into a set of problem-solving techniques and leadership lessons that can be applied in business. Armed conflict between opposing groups is as old as humanity itself, and as long as war has existed, military leaders have endeavored to develop innovative tactics and methods to defeat their adversaries. Maneuver warfare's emergence is a direct result of this process. Only after many centuries did it develop into a fully articulated doctrine. But in the past 65 years, its evolution has accelerated so dramatically that it now occupies a preeminent place in military thought. Elements of maneuver warfare first appeared in the tactics employed by the ancient Greeks, who pioneered the use of unbalanced formations to attack opponents' weaknesses, and in the writings of Chinese General Sun Tzu. In The Art of War, written around 500 BC, Sun Tzu prescribed a series of distracting tactics and rapid, calculated moves that pitted strength against weakness to achieve a decisive outcome. Indeed, Sun Tzu epitomized maneuver warfare when he suggested that the best victories were achieved when the enemy realized he was defeated and simply did not offer battle. 16 centuries later, Genghis Khan led his Mongol hordes halfway around the globe and nearly conquered the known world. No army could match the blistering speed of his highly skilled, entirely horse-mounted forces, and no commander could match his use of communications, a sophisticated system of swift messengers and signal flags to react to and shape events as they unfolded. Genghis Khan repeatedly used these advantages to seize the initiative from opponents and dictate the terms of battle. Equally effective was his masterful use of arrows, javelins, and even Chinese firecrackers, and his employment of diversionary tactics to disrupt opponents' cohesion. The next major wave of innovation in maneuver warfare hit 18th and 19th century Europe. In the 18th century, the Prussians pioneered the use of mission orders, which maximized flexibility and speed by stating broadly what needed to be accomplished and leaving completion of the task at hand to the ingenuity and resourcefulness of subordinate leaders. At the dawn of the 19th century, the legendary French general Napoleon Bonaparte repeatedly achieved decisive victories by splitting his forces in the face of a larger enemy and unexpectedly bringing overwhelming might to bear on his opponent's weakest point at the most opportune moment. In World War I, the Germans pioneered a new type of attack, infiltration, to break the stalemate created by the conventional tactics of trench warfare. Once highly skilled scout units had identified weak points in enemy lines and had penetrated far behind enemy strong points, large reinforcements immediately followed. Complementing this unique decentralized approach was the use of mission orders, a Prussian legacy, to preserve maximum flexibility during the attack. The initial successes of these innovative tactics, coupled with the sting of eventual defeat at the hands of the Allies, prompted the Germans to develop an entirely new, sophisticated approach to combat after the war. The first broadly disseminated articulations of this new approach, widely regarded as maneuver warfare's modern conceptual foundation, appeared in 1937 with the publication of Attacks by German military officer Erwin Rommel, later known as the Desert Fox, and with the publication of Achtung Panzer by Heinz Guderian, another well-known German military officer. These two master tacticians advocated a radically new approach to combat, fast-moving, decentralized forces that deeply penetrated an enemy's rear area at breakneck speed, disrupted his balance, and prevented him from using his reserve forces. This last point is critically important. In World War I, the time needed for an attacker to exploit an initial advantage was so long, and consolidation of gains so slow, that the enemy nearly always had time to bring up reserves from behind the lines and plug any gap created by the attacker. Thus, even if the attacker achieved breakthrough, an initial tactical advantage, he seldom converted it into breakout, a momentum-shifting strategic advantage. Achieving breakout by exploiting gains before the enemy had time to respond was the aim of this new approach to warfare. The second half of the 20th century witnessed a major contribution to modern maneuver warfare theory, and several landmark victories that validated the viability of maneuver warfare as a modern combat philosophy. U.S. Air Force Colonel John Boyd's contention that conflict could be understood in terms of OODA loops, time-competitive cycles of observing, orienting, deciding, and acting, brought considerable focus on relative decision-making speed as a key determinant of success in combat. And resounding victories by modern practitioners of maneuver warfare notably the Germans during the invasion of France in 1940, MacArthur at Inchon in 1950, the Israelis in the 1967 war, and the coalition forces in Operation Desert Storm in 1991, all proved that maneuver warfare theory was devastatingly effective when applied in practice. The latest in this long line of practitioners of what we now know as maneuver warfare is the United States Marine Corps, which has long prided itself on being at the leading edge of tactical innovation. Ever since its first landing on the beach at Nassau, Bahamas, during the Revolutionary War in 1776, the Marine Corps has continuously refined the doctrine of amphibious ship-to-shore attacks. In the 1930s and 1940s, the Marines were among the first Allied aviators to provide close air support to troops on the ground by dropping bombs or strafing with machine guns at low altitudes. In the 1950s, the Marines pioneered the use of the helicopter to support and transport ground forces, thereby revolutionizing mobility and operations on the battlefield. But not until the late 1980s, under the guidance of General Gray, did senior Marine leaders come to the realization that their organization needed to rethink how it approached armed conflict. A perennially underfunded and undermanned organization, the Marine Corps would once again have to do more with less. Defense drawdowns in the wake of the Cold War threatened to further erode its budget and manpower levels. But as America's 911 force in readiness, Marines would continue to be called on to face more heavily equipped foes in unfamiliar and distant locales. With the publication of Warfighting in 1989, the Marines, once a devil-be-damned charge-up-the-middle outfit, formally adopted maneuver warfare as doctrinal philosophy. Maneuver warfare today. The maneuver warfare philosophy, tailor-made for a smaller, lighter force with limited resources, is particularly well-suited to today's combat environment. Traditional battle lines have blurred. Weapons have become incredibly accurate and therefore extremely lethal. Communications advances have increased the flow of information on the battlefield, often to the point of overload, and have created a new dimension in armed conflict: electronic warfare. Speed and distance in engagements have increased. Multinational coalition warfare has become common practice. Entirely new types of low-intensity conflicts have emerged in countries such as Somalia, Bosnia, and Afghanistan, where the identities of amorphous enemies are increasingly difficult to distinguish. Rules of engagement restrict available alternatives, media scrutiny is intense, and the liability of collateral damage has heightened. Accompanying all of this change are the enduring constants of human fear, exhaustion, and confusion, as well as exogenous factors such as unforeseeable contingencies and unpredictable weather. Indeed, the pressure to make sound and timely decisions in armed conflict has never been greater. As you can surely attest, the pressure to make sound and timely decisions in business is also greater than it has ever been. To guide and improve your decision-making amid friction, uncertainty, fluidity, and disorder, and to show you how you can use maneuver warfare to lead your organization in the modern business environment, we dedicate the remainder of this book to examining, in great detail, maneuver warfare's 7 guiding principles and enabling leadership prescriptions. But first, to set the stage, we offer in the coming chapter the Arab-Israeli War of 1967. In this textbook example of maneuver warfare, an undermanned, resource-constrained force achieved an overwhelmingly decisive victory against a numerically superior opponent in a minimal amount of time and with a minimal loss of human life. This is not a story about the U.S. Marines, but you can bet that the Marines have studied it extensively and have emulated many of the practices that made the Israelis successful in this war. We hope you will find it, and the detailed review of the Israelis' actions in Chapter 2, equally enlightening. Chapter 2. An Integrated Attack. The Arab-Israeli War of 1967. At 8:15 a.m. on June 5, 1967, under a bright sun and clear skies, the unsuspecting Egyptian Air Force was conducting a changeover of patrols, as it always did at that hour. Suddenly, 250 aircraft, almost the entire Israeli Air Force, IAF, appeared out of nowhere and unleashed a preemptive airstrike against 11 Egyptian air bases that gave the IAF total air supremacy. As the bombs landed on Egyptian airfields, Israeli Defense Force, IDF commanders cried, "Kadima! Head for the enemy!" and launched a three-pronged ground attack across the Sinai Peninsula. The IDF ripped through the Egyptians' defensive lines, wreaked havoc in their ranks, and shattered their command infrastructure. A mere 4 days later, on the verge of total collapse, the numerically superior and more heavily equipped Egyptians agreed to a ceasefire. Background. By the spring of 1967, Middle Eastern tensions had reached a flashpoint, and the third war between Israel and its Arab neighbors in less than 20 years was imminent. The first theater of the war would be the Sinai Peninsula, the barren, rugged landmass separating Israel and the Red Sea from more than 100,000 troops and 1,000 tanks along Israel's relatively expansive southern border. Egypt had also built air bases on the Sinai, positioning its bombers within minutes of the Israeli capital. Israel feared that its very existence as a nation was in jeopardy. Even after a nationwide activation of all available reservists, it could muster only 200,000 ground troops, 800 tanks, and 262 airplanes. The combined Arab coalition force, which comprised Egypt, Syria, and Jordan, with support from Saudi Arabia, Lebanon, Iraq, Kuwait, Algeria, and Sudan, and threatened Israeli borders on 3 fronts, totaled approximately 465,000 soldiers, 2,880 tanks, and 810 aircraft. The linchpin of the Arabs' air power, Egypt, alone possessed more than 400 planes. Rather than wait to be attacked, Israel devised a plan to launch an all-out preemptive strike against the Egyptians in an attempt to secure the safety of its homeland and dictate the course of events of the engagement. Israeli leaders surmised that if Egypt, the leader of the Arab coalition, were defeated, the other members would follow suit. General Yeshayahu Gavish led the Israeli ground forces in the Sinai. Gavish split his army into 3 divisions, which were led by Generals Yisrael Tal, Ariel Sharon, who would later become Prime Minister of Israel, and Avraham Yaffe. All 4 men were veterans of the Arab-Israeli War of 1956 and knew the Sinai well. Tal's division would attack through the north. Sharon's division would attack and eliminate the multi-layered Egyptian defensive positions in the central Sinai. And Yaffe would secure the axis between Sharon and Tal, thereby protecting their flanks from the vast enemy reinforcements that were staged in defensive rings throughout the Sinai. Air attack and the onset of war. By identifying its own greatest weakness first, susceptibility to Egyptian air attack, Israel concluded that it must first remove the Egyptian air threat. Israel reasoned that air superiority was absolutely essential, not only to protect its homeland, but also to preserve its ability to wage a successful ground campaign. The smaller IDF ground force would need to conduct its lightning strike-style attack across the Sinai without fear of enemy air attack. Unbeknownst to the Arab coalition, Israel would hurl all but 12 of its planes at Egypt. This bold move, which left the Israeli homeland almost completely vulnerable to attack from the air, created the risk of catastrophic loss. But the potential reward of destroying the Egyptian Air Force on the ground was adequate justification. The Israeli attack relied heavily on the element of surprise. Israel carefully planned the time of attack, not at dawn, as the Egyptians expected, but at 8 a.m., during the Egyptians' regularly scheduled breakfast and rest period. Israeli pilots stealthily approached at dangerously low altitudes and maintained strict radio silence to ensure that they were not detected by Egyptian radar or communication systems. And by launching at carefully calculated intervals, the Israeli aircraft arrived at their targets at exactly the same time and delivered a simultaneous strike. Egyptian air bases could not warn each other of attack because they were all under attack at the same time. Moreover, during the previous 2 years, the Israelis had staged some sort of flight exercise every morning at the same time. This repetition created ambiguity for the Egyptians in their interpretation of radar signals. When Egyptian radar spotted an unusually large number of Israeli planes taking off on June 5th, air defense commanders dismissed the blips as simply a larger number of routine training flights. The Israelis knew of the Egyptian practice of sending pilots to their planes as soon as enemy aircraft appeared on radar and exploited it accordingly. As they neared their target, the IAF pilots suddenly increased altitude and appeared on the Egyptians' radar screens. This deliberate forewarning set a trap. As the Egyptian pilots scrambled to man their planes, the IAF was in prime position to eliminate both the aircraft and their crews. The results were devastating. The Egyptians were not fully aware of the attack until some 300 of their aircraft, over half of their air force, had been eliminated, and 1/3 of their pilots had been killed. By 10:30 that morning, a top Egyptian general noted, "The Egyptian Air Force ceased to exist." The IAF had eliminated what it deemed the principal threat to the Israeli homeland, and paved the way for the IDF ground forces to attack the Sinai with little threat of air attack. Ground attack. The Egyptians had positioned their ground forces in 3 heavily fortified lines covered by massive interlocking firepower. This configuration, modeled after the Soviet doctrine of defense in depth, was formidable. But Israeli senior leaders, owing to their experiences in previous wars and to years of exhaustive intelligence gathering, the Israelis' version of due diligence, had identified Egypt's Achilles heel, or critical vulnerability, a slow and cumbersome centralized decision-making process, far removed from the action on the ground and the information needed to control it. Under the Egyptian system of command and control, rigid, detailed orders were given from central locations, thereby leaving scant opportunity for frontline commanders to make decisions or react to changing situations. Egyptian frontline units were not free to open fire or make decisions without approval from higher command, and frontline soldiers were removed from officers with decision-making authority by many layers. These shortcomings, coupled with an understanding of the paralyzing fear associated with isolation in desert warfare, led the Israelis to believe that they could cause their enemy's collapse by rapidly bypassing frontline units, penetrating deep into rear areas, and systematically dividing forces, all before the Egyptians could organize an effective counterattack. General Tal moved first, and, though assigned the least ground to cover, had perhaps the most daunting task. Ahead of him lay 4 Egyptian divisions, each heavily armed and densely compressed along the northernmost route between the Israeli border and the Suez Canal. Rather than match his strength against that of his much larger opponent, Tal opted to selectively attack key points in the Egyptian defenses with overwhelming force. In several instances he ordered the 3 brigades under his command to focus all of their tanks into fists of armor, which were sufficiently powerful to punch through the Egyptians' lines and then fan out to attack several key objectives. Tal's tactics were so effective that, by the end of day 1, his forces had moved beyond Khan Yunis and penetrated all the way to the town of Al-Arish, well ahead of where he planned to attack on day 2. When his forces reached Al-Arish, Egyptian frontline...
Sample complete. Ready to continue?